Welcome to the first video demonstration of Lua4Delphi version 2. For those who don't know me, my name is Simon J Stuart, otherwise known as Lua4Delphi. I'm a systems architect for software and web applications, an Embarcadero technology partner, and my specialist fields are automation and productivity enhancement systems. Today I'll be demonstrating some of the basics of Lua4Delphi version 2, primarily focusing on the most commonly raised question, which is how difficult will it be to integrate Lua4Delphi into my application. By the end of this video you will understand how to configure a Lua4Delphi instance for use in your application, registering Delphi methods, functions, so that they may be called from a Lua script, communicating between Delphi and Lua and vice versa, a brief introduction to Lua Stack and the Lua4Delphi Stack managers, which consist of two parts, which are reading Lua values from Delphi and reading Delphi values from Lua. I'd just like to say that this video will only show a small portion of what Lua4Delphi is capable, and further videos will build on this so that you generate a full understanding of Lua4Delphi version 2 and what it means for you. This version of Lua4Delphi will only work on Delphi 2010 and Delphi XE, including the starter editions now available from Embarcadero. We're going to begin this video by demonstrating how to integrate Lua4Delphi, or rather how to create an instance of Lua4Delphi in your new or existing applications. Okay, so you're going to first create or open your project in Delphi. In this case, I've created a new demo project, which I've called Demo Vid1, as you can see here. And it's a standard VCL forms application, just a blank form. I've set its caption, given it a name, and so on. And we are going to add the Lua4Delphi core unit to the users section, and that's called L4D. The first thing we want to do now, after we've added the unit to the users section, is to define our instance. Now, for the sake of this demo, I'm going to define it as a private member. You can define it any way you like, basically. You can have it local scope, although I don't see what the point would be in that. You can define it as a global variable, or as a public, or whatever you like. You can do whatever you like with it. You can have it as a property within another component if you wanted to. Just depends on what your needs are and what you're doing with it. So, we're going to create F instance, and that is a TL4D instance. Now, all Lua4Delphi instances are TL4D instance. And at this point I should explain, Lua4Delphi is not a standard component that sits on your component palette up here. You don't just click on it and drop it on your form and everyone's happy. Lua4Delphi, it has its own centralized instance manager, and that is because of the way data is shared between instances, or rather can be shared between instances, and so on, which are things we'll touch on in another video. Now this means that you can create as many instances of Lua4Delphi as you like. Rather than dropping a component on your form from the palette, you have to define, or rather you have to invoke your instances through code, which is what we'll do now. So, for the sake of this demo, I'm going to use the onCreate event of the form to create our instance. So in this case, the instance name that we've given it is F-instance. And Lua4Delphi's central manager is called Lua4Delphi. Makes things easy. So we do Lua4Delphi.new. We can specify an instance name for each instance we create. Now, a good reason to do this is that if you get an error message or an exception as a result of, or during the course of a Lua script running, it will show you the name of the instance that failed. If you give it a name and it shows you the name, then you will be able to far easier and quicker, you'll be able to determine the location of the fault and the bug and fix it. Okay, so in this case I'm going to call it demo instance. Now, now we have our Lua4Delphi instance created. It is there. We can start to use it. And because we're going to perform multiple sequential operations on that object, I'm going to use a with block. Of course you don't have to, but I'm going to, because it's easier and it's less code and it's neater and so on. So I'm now localized within the scope of f instance. Okay. And the very first thing I'm going to do for the sake of this demo is initialize it. So when we initialize a Lua4Delphi instance, that basically links in Lua and it creates the Lua environment that that we're going to be interacting with from Delphi, and it just sets it up so that it's ready to go. Now, the reason you have to call initialize explicitly is because you can, if you want to, change some of the default options and configuration of Lua prior to creating the instance, or rather prior to initializing the instance, so that it behaves a different way. But we don't need to do that for the sake of this demo, and in fact I don't imagine that for 99.9% of people's needs, I don't imagine they will have to change any of those default options at all. So in this demo we won't discuss that, but we may discuss it in a later video at some other time. So what we're going to do now that we've initialized our instance is first of all we're going to register some functions, and then we're going to register some globals. A global is literally, it is a global variable, but defined in Lua. So it's not defined in the scope of Delphi. It's defined within Lua. However, we can communicate with, or read and write, global values from Lua, to and from Lua, I should say, from within our Delphi code. So I will demonstrate that to you in a moment. And then we're going to execute our Lua script. Okay. So first I'll just quickly touch on these globals. Now, what we can do is we can call globals, give it a string name, in this case foo, tell it its type. Now, for the sake of writing one, we can specify exactly what type it is. Now, at this point in development, and there'll be more by the time it's released, we have pointers, booleans, doubles, extendeds, integers, singles, strings, and Lua tables. Lua tables are one of the most interesting and important aspects of Lua as a language, and they're also quite complex. However, Lua tables, from the standpoint of Lua4Delphi, are very easy to create and parse. So you can actually read them from Delphi, and you can create them from Delphi and push them back to Lua. So we're going to define this global variable foo as a string, and the value for that will be, we'll call it bar. Now, for anybody who's familiar with Lua, they'll probably recognize the standard foo bar concept as it's described in the Programming in Lua book, which is available on the Lua website at lua.org, along with Lua's actual manual, both of which are worth reading, but they are not strictly required reading. So in other words, you don't need to understand every single aspect of Lua in order to use Lua4Delphi. The API for Lua has been abstracted in Lua4Delphi so that there is a nice, relatable, recognizable way for we Delphi developers to communicate with Lua and vice versa. So everything's made simple, and that is exactly what I'm trying to demonstrate to you now. Okay, so this one line of code will actually expose a global variable with the name foo and the value bar. At this point, just so we are absolutely clear, the variable name foo is defined with a capital F, and Lua is a case-sensitive language. So if I tried to do, I'll show you here. If I tried to do foo, that would be a nil object. It doesn't exist. It has to be with the capital F, otherwise it won't work. Okay, and the same applies with functions and pretty much everything in Lua, right down to the syntax of the language itself. It's entirely case sensitive, so that is something you may have to get used to, but I always try to develop everything in a case sensitive way anyway, so I don't particularly mind. Okay, so we have defined our global. Now I'm going to show you a quick demonstration of how to create an object bound method that we can expose to Lua. To make everyone's lives easier, Lua4Delphi ships with a series of templates, code templates. This is one I'm going to show you now. It's the only one I've put in place so far. And if I hit enter now, it will generate, as you can see, the bare bones of the function that I am about to insert. So I will give it a function name, and I'm going to call this print strings. Okay, and I'll explain why shortly. The forms class name is tfrm-main in this instance. Of course, use your own class names as appropriate. And now I'll discuss result, and this is very important. If you get this wrong, you will cause countless problems for yourself. Okay, if you are not returning a value back to Lua as a result of this function, or within this function rather, you set result to 0. If you don't do that, you will get an exception. Every time you will get an exception, the program will crash and everything goes mad. If we are pushing a value into Lua from this function, so if we're actually giving Lua some data, we will set the value of result to the index on Lua's stack at which that value resides. Now, the full ins and outs of Lua's stack are insanely complicated, actually, far beyond the scope of this particular video. But if you do take a look at the CAPI and watch further video demonstrations I shall be presenting, you will have a much better understanding of Lua's stack. What I will be touching on very shortly, in just a couple of minutes, is the Lua4Delphi stack managers, which you can see defined here as TL4D stack, and there are a couple of subtypes of stack for various different case-specific things. Okay, anyway, moving on quickly. We don't need the instance name because we're going to move this into our with clause here. And so here we have this line, as it says above, we move into the private section of our class. Okay, so I'm going to put that there. I'm going to get rid of the mess, and we don't need the annotation. And this line here, methods.register, that goes in here where we want to register our function. And that's it. Literally as simple as it can be. We now have a function in Delphi called print strings, which is now registered with Lua by the same name. However, we don't want it to have the same name, because adopting Lua's standard convention, I want to give Lua a print method. Now, you don't have to give Lua a print method, but consider that most Lua scripting savvy people will expect there to be some sort of print method exposed to the Lua environment by your host application. It's kind of the done thing. So, in order to make that happen, we just change the string parameter of methods.register. We change it from print strings, we just change it to print. Now again, remember, Lua is case sensitive. So if I tried to call this within my script with a capital P, it would crash. Or rather, it would just raise an exception. It would be a problem. However, I have overloaded this method in such a way as you can account for that by using an array of strings and passing each name you want to give it. So now I can call it with lowercase or with an uppercase P. Okay, so now we're covered for both eventualities. Now, strictly speaking, that's a little bit dirty. Technically, in most cases, you would want to expose it in one or the other and call it a day, and you would want to stick with that convention. Whatever, if you use an uppercase letter at the beginning, then you use that in your script. If you use a lowercase, just use lowercase, and so on. But just for those who are picky about that sort of thing and want a little bit of case insensitivity, you can define the same method with two different names from Lua's perspective. Okay. So what are we going to make this print strings method do? Okay. Well, for the sake of this demo, I'm going to drop a T memo on the form and just neaten it up quickly. I will leave the name as it is, but I'll align it all client and I'll give it some scroll bars and so on. And I shall clean out the text just so it's nice and plain. Okay, I'm going to save that. Now, within our method, remember, this function for all intents and purposes is a Lua function. It may be defined in our Pascal unit in Delphi code, but it is only invoked by Lua. We never call this from Delphi directly. There's no point because there's no stack for it to work with. Okay, so when Lua calls this function, when it invokes it, it will pass along a stack, and the stack will be populated by the parameters that are passed to the function when it is called. And they're passed in order starting from number 1 going up to however many parameters there are. It doesn't matter, you can have 20 or 30 or whatever, depending on the configuration of Lua. You can have as many as you like. What we're going to do with this function is we're simply going to go through all of those parameters and print in this memo any parameter values that are or can be a string. So we're going to need an iterator, so we'll give it a value, an I integer, typical, and we're going to do a for loop, for I equals 0 to a Lua stack dot count, which will tell us how many, it's 1, it equals 1. Unlike arrays and other types in Delphi, Lua4Delphi, the stack, Lua stack, starts at index 1 and goes up to the count, so there's no -1 required anywhere. Okay. And what it's going to do is it's going to say if a Lua stack and then I, which is the index we're looking at, can be string. Okay, just so you can see, we also have can be double and so on for each type, and all this will do is return true or false as to whether or not that value can be interpreted as a string. And if it can, then it's going to do memo1.lines.add a Lua stack I as a string. There we go, as a string. So now it'll iterate through every parameter that is passed when you call print from Lua, and it will see if it can be a string, and if it can, it will add it, or add its value rather, to this memo. So you'll just get a long list of lines for each string parameter. The next thing this little demo needs to do is it needs to execute a Lua script, as you can see here. So in order to do that, we do execute Lua file. And for the sake of this file can be, you can give it a full path and a file name. It can be anywhere you like and called anything you want. It doesn't even have to end with .lua, although that obviously is better for convention purposes. It's better to have a standard file extension that everybody can relate to and recognize. I mean, you can also use, if you'd prefer, you can use .l4d or anything that's specific to your application just to set it apart from a normal Lua script. Keeping in mind that this is specifically engineered, this script will be tailored specifically for your application. So whatever methods you provide Lua with, they will be available, but only in your application. Okay, Lua itself has very little of any inherent functionality built into it. It is designed as to be very, very small, lightweight, and extensible, so you give Lua the functionality. You tell Lua with your host application what it can and can't do. And then the script will be able to make use of that functionality, which is exactly what this print method we've just registered does. It gives Lua a print function, which is registered in our host application. So when we call print, it will call this method from our Lua script. It'll call it in our compiled host application, and it'll do exactly what this method does. Iterate through the parameters, check if they're a string. Sorry, I've done this wrong. And many of you will probably have been screaming at the screen, he's done it wrong! Well, easily corrected, we just change it to can be string. That's my own stupidity. Good job I noticed. And then it'll print it on the screen, okay? So, for the sake of this demo application, I am going to use the same file name as the video. The demo video 1, demovid1.exe, but I'm going to change the extension to Lua. I'm going to do that by change file ext application.exe-name.lua. So whatever the name of the executable is at runtime, it will load the appropriate .lua alternative. So demovid1.lua will be loaded at runtime. I'm just going to quickly save that, and the next stage of this development is to produce the actual Lua script. Ignore that error, please. It's failing on my installation of Notepad++. We'll set it as a Lua script. And the very first thing I'm going to make the script do, just as a demonstration, is I'm going to make it print the value of foo. Remember, foo is passed to Lua from our host application. It is a global variable registered here, and the value will be bar. So when that line of code executes, and it runs through this, the memo on our form should simply say foo in the top. Just the first line should be foo and nothing else. Okay, so we now have our script. So if I execute this application now, it'll do exactly what we've just been discussing there, and there you go. It's executed the script, and the value bar has been inserted into the top line of our memo. It's as simple as that. And so just so you can see it procedurally, it creates our Lua instance. It initializes the instance. We register our print method. We do it with two names. Remember, I'm doing it just so we can use a capital P if we prefer. We register our global variable foo and give it the value bar, which is a string. And then it executes the Lua file according to the name of our executable. That Lua script then executes this line of code here, print foo, which in turn calls this function defined in Delphi, which tells it that we're not giving any results back to Lua. It iterates through all the parameters on the stack, and if it can be a string, it prints it out. And just to enhance on this slightly, back in our Lua script, I'll just add some extra strings. Now, in Lua we can use both double quotes and single quotes. So I'm using double quotes because that's more the done thing in Lua, but you can use a single quote just as you would in Delphi. That's fine. So now if I run the program again, having modified the Lua script, you will see that it prints bar hello world, which is exactly what it should print in accordance with the script that we gave it. Print foo hello world. Okay? Remembering the value of foo is bar. So that is how we call or invoke a Delphi method from Lua, and how we set up our host application accordingly. I mean, that is pretty simple, don't you agree? That is as simple as it can physically get. In the next Lua4Delphi video, I will be dealing with how to register classes and existing instances of classes with Lua. For example, how to register a T-button class, and how to register T-button instances, such as, say, button 1, so that we can interact with those objects or create new instances of those objects from our Lua scripts. This is the most important aspect of Lua4Delphi, in that it allows you to visually extend your application as well as functionally extend your application. And we'll be covering that next time. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoy Lua4Delphi 2 when it comes out shortly. Thank you.